How many secrets can one person hide before it starts to affect their life? It was a question Dan had asked himself more times than he cared to remember, although it wasn't what was on his mind this morning as he settled down with his usual cup of coffee and the morning paper. Dan heard a noise and looked up from the newspaper, seeing a young man walking along his house. "Can I help you, young man?" he asked before taking another sip from his cup. The gentleman stopped and looked around, as if he was not sure whether he was where he should be or how to begin. "I'm looking for Mr. Daniel Patrick Mason. Is that you, sir?" Dan's brow furrowed, and he felt tension begin to seep into his neck muscles. Maybe or maybe not. Depends on who is asking and why does he need it. The young man straightened up and looked down at the man standing in front of him. "My name is Jason Stevenson, and I need to know if it's you. Otherwise, it's none of your business why I need it." Jason had seen photos of Mr. Mason, but the man had a full beard and long, shoulder-length hair, making the identification a little dubious. Dan sighed and returned to his newspaper. "Well, Jason Stevenson, you should know a little more about Daniel Patrick Mason, and don't waste my time." Dan felt his face turn red and tried to suppress his anger at this young guy's impudence. If Dan had been watching, he would have seen the hesitation on his face Jason when he turned on his heels and began to walk back around the house. After taking only a few steps without turning around, he said, "My friend Gracie really misses her father, and I'm looking for him. Do you have a daughter, sir?" He took the risk. Dan's cup stopped halfway to his mouth when his breath caught at the mention of that name, and he glanced at the young man's back. In a broken voice, he replied, "I'm sorry about this, but I don't have children, so I can't help you, Mr. Stevenson." Jason heard the tremble in the man's voice and knew he had hit the mark. Turning around, he continued, "Somehow it's hard for me to believe this. My information is rarely wrong. I believe you are Mr. Mason, and you have a daughter named Gracie Lynn Mason. Your wife's name is Kathleen Rose Mason. You also have two sons, Joshua Benedict and Robert Luther. They are twins." Dan watched as Jason stood and stubbornly looked at him as if he was saying, "Prove me wrong." Jason watched as Dan's face hardened at this information. "Well, am I wrong in what I said, or will you admit it?" Dan's eyes clouded over as all his memories came flooding back, threatening to overwhelm him. Jason certainly knew a lot about the family, more than was necessary for a casual acquaintance. The last time he saw this so-called family was just under 4 years ago, and it was the last thing he wanted to encounter. Dan remembered the last time he was with his family. He had been in good spirits throughout the week. The sale of the cottage had been completed, and he was looking forward to handing over the title to Kat on their 15th wedding anniversary. It was their dream to have a small holiday home when the time came and the children would be independent. Coming home used to be something rare for him, but now, standing in the kitchen doorway with roses and chocolate in his hands, he heard the voices of Gracie and her mother. He wanted to wait until they were gone so he could wrap and hide the gifts for the evening. While hiding, he listened as his wife spoke to Gracie. "So, is everything ready for this evening?" Kat asked her daughter. "Don't worry, Mom. Everything is going according to plan. I've reserved you a room at the Harriet, a honeymoon suite, a jacuzzi, a king bed, champagne, and strawberries. It's all about management. Does he suspect anything?" "You're kidding. We would need a siren to get anything across to my stupid husband. You know how he is. The sun could stop rising, and he wouldn't notice until the solar hot water system starts cooling. God, it's been so long that I don't even remember what it's like. How do we distract him?" Dan felt an arrow pierce his heart. "Is this what my loving wife thinks of me?" "Don't worry about that either. Josh and Rob are taking him golfing. I told them everything, and they supported the idea. They laughed their heads off when I told them. I know I'm so happy that I can do this for you." Dan felt his stomach turn, remembering his life with his family. "My children seem to share my wife's opinion of a loving father. He's been trying to persuade them to go with him for a long time, so I finally convinced them to agree. They promised to keep him away from us until this was all over." Dan experienced the humiliation again as if it were yesterday, and no matter how hard he tried, it showed on his face. With tension in his eyes, he admitted, "You are right about two things, Mr. Stevenson. I'm Dan Mason, and I was married to Kathleen, although I think she most likely already divorced me to be with her lover and the father of her children." Jason shook his head in amazement. "I must admit that I am new to this family. I met Gracie 18 months ago, but from what she tells me, I find it hard to believe your statement. They don't understand why you disappeared. As far as I know, Mrs. Mason has not divorced you or dated anyone else. I understand that all of Mrs. Mason's children are yours, and they love you and miss you very much." Dan managed to get his emotions under control, and, looking at the young man in front of him, he said, "Well, this proves that not all of your information is accurate. Out of curiosity, how did you find me?" Jason pointed to a chair on the other side of the small table where Dan's cup of coffee sat and received a curt nod. Sitting down, he continued, "The family has been looking for you since you disappeared, Mr. Mason. Mrs. Mason spent tens of thousands of dollars on private investigators with minimal success." Dan studied Jason's face, trying to determine his sincerity. "I know that there were people who tried to find me, but I managed to avoid them before they found me. It looks like I underestimated you in this matter." Jason smiled sheepishly. "I must admit, I have a certain advantage that other investigators do not have, but I will not go into details. Suffice it to say, I work for a government agency that processes information, and I used my resources in an unethical manner to find you." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Some secret government black ops agency?" Jason chuckled, but not at the mention of his workplace. Tracking terrorists was now a priority, and his desk was littered with various information. His amusement was due to the thought that he had managed to establish a small contact with the man whom he hoped to see as his future father-in-law. "It's not that dramatic, and while I have a duty to keep secrets, most of what I do is pretty boring, and this little adventure was quite exciting." Dan frowned. "I'm glad you find it funny to interfere in other people's lives." Jason stepped back. "Please, sir, don't get me wrong. I'm doing this for the one I love and her family. They miss you dearly and want you to return to where they think you belong. The fact that I've enjoyed this journey of discovery, well, now that I've found you, that's just the icing on the cake, if you will." Dan screwed up his face in confusion. "You keep saying that they miss me when I'm damn sure they don't. I suggest you go back and do some more research, young man, and leave me alone." Jason leaned back in his chair and thought. He loved puzzles, and this was a huge puzzle with many missing pieces. "Can I ask you a favor?" Dan felt even more wary, which was reflected on his face. "Why should I do you a favor when I don't know you, young man, and have nothing to gain from it?" Jason saw the truth in his words. "I understand your reluctance, but I have my reasons, and I will explain them, although I may say more about my work than I am allowed by law." Jason thought that perhaps by putting himself in a vulnerable position at work, Mr. Mason would feel more inclined to open up about his past. Dan looked at Jason impassively. "Fine, quid pro quo. You will tell me why you are so damn interested in my problems and the problems of the family I left behind. What's so important that you're willing to spend hours tracking down someone who clearly doesn't want to be found? Maybe then I'll think about your request." Jason smiled to himself and nodded. "Fair deal, Mr. Mason. I can boil my job down to two words. Accountant. An unusual accountant, like an accountant. Instead of numbers, I process facts, but that's what I do. I take scraps of information, connect them, and, thanks to my talent, draw conclusions. I have a tendency to see patterns in information and facts. I am very good at this, and the government pays me very well for my services. I have applied my knowledge to this situation, and there are too many variables at this point to come to any real conclusion. Think of it like a detective novel where we only have half the pages, and those pages are out of order, or like a puzzle with half the pieces missing." Dan nodded. Intrigue captured him. "Let me guess, were you fascinated by Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes as a child?" "That's right, Mr. Mason, in a large, very large walnut shell. Collecting events from limited information gives me a charge like nothing else." Dan looked at the man sitting opposite him and thought about his words. Something was missing here, and it was more than mere curiosity. This only answers half of my question. Is there something else here that you're not talking about? Jason chuckled. Curiosity is contagious, isn't it, Mr. Mason? But you're right, I have an ulterior motive. You see, I love Gracie and we want to get married, but there is one small but significant problem. Jason shifted unsteadily in his chair. Gracie desperately wants her father to walk her down the aisle. I am truly afraid that she will remain lonely until her father returns to her. I also have the need to ask him for her hand in marriage. Now I can solve my problem without leaving here, but this does not solve your daughter's problem. Dan picked up the cup and was disappointed to find that it was empty. Damn you, Mr. Stevenson. Don't try to emotionally blackmail me. If you think so, then bark on the wrong tree. Getting irritated, he suddenly stopped. He needed time to calm down. After asking Jason if he wanted a cup of coffee, he headed into the cabin to refill his. Jason was shocked by the outburst of emotion, knowing he needed to be patient, and called after him. I'm sorry for upsetting you, and I didn't mean to put pressure on you, Mr. Mason. Jason mentally chided himself for his stupid remark. Yes, Mr. Mason, I would like coffee, thank you, with 2 spoons of sugar and milk, if possible. Dan threw the folder on the table, placing his cup in front of Jason. I can help you solve both of your problems, and I don't have to go anywhere to do it, Mr. Stevenson. Dan leaned back in his chair. First of all, asking me for permission to marry Gracie is a waste of time, and if she wants her father to walk her down the aisle, then you better find someone named Edward Carlyle. I'm not 100% sure that he is her father, but it is more than likely. Dan pointed to the folder. These DNA results prove that I am not the father of any of Kathleen's children. They say all the children are full siblings, but I don't have Edward's DNA samples to compare with, so it's all guesswork on my part. Dan took a sip of his coffee before continuing. I just know that Kathleen had an affair with Mr. Carlyle a month before she told me she was pregnant with twins. You do your research and tell me I'm wrong. Jason sat back after reading the report. Wow, this really makes a difference. Dan and Jason spent several hours talking about events leading up to the present time, even casting a couple of fishing rods from the pier overlooking the lake. So, Jason, what favor did you want to ask? Jason was lost in thought, reeling in his fishing rod and preparing to leave. Oh, sorry, I was in my own thoughts. I wanted to ask you if you could escort Gracie to our wedding, but now things have gotten a little more complicated than I thought. I ask you to allow me to keep in touch with you. Even though I enjoyed the chase, I don't want to go through all that again to find you if I can avoid it. And believe me, I can find you again. Dan sighed. I suppose so, Mr. Stevenson, okay, on one condition. I have a pretty good feeling about the people I do business with. My social life is a different matter, and I see that you are a man of your word. I don't think the government would keep you on the job if you couldn't be trusted. I want you to promise that you won't tell them where I am, won't give them my phone number without my consent, and keep them away from me at all costs. You can tell them that I am fine, I am healthy, and do not want to reunite with them. Jason extended his hand. Mr. Mason, I give you my word that I will do everything possible to respect your privacy. But I would like to continue this investigation and find out where this all leads, if that's okay with you. Dan smiled. He began to warmly treat this young man. Take action. I almost went crazy trying to figure out why they did this and was left with nothing. If you get to the bottom of this, then be sure to come back and enlighten the old fool. Gracie watched as Jason closed the car door. She wondered where he had been all day, leaving before dawn and returning only late at night. Where the hell have you been, Jason? I was crazy. Jason stood at the foot of the steps leading to the front porch, looking at the woman who had won his heart. I'm tired, Grace, and I really need to eat and drink. Can we wait until I'm at least in the house before you start reprimanding me? Gracie stepped back and motioned for him to pass. There's no dinner. I didn't know when you'd be back, and I've already eaten, so at best I'll make you a sandwich. Jason ignored Gracie's irritation, but knew he would have to say something sooner or later. The problem was that she wouldn't like it, no matter how he phrased it. "A sandwich will do, honey. Just let me change my clothes and grab a beer." "I have good and bad news." Gracie noticed the worry on Jason's face, and her initial irritation faded. "What happened, Jason? What happened?" Jason waited for a long time, trying to organize all the facts. The ticking of the wall clock seemed like thunder, and finally he said, "I found Mr. Mason." Jason was toying with whether Gracie would realize that he hadn't called the man he'd been looking for the past month father. Gracie dizzy and dropped the knife she was using to cut the tomato. The knife slipped out of her hands and fell to the floor with a clang. "Have you found Dad? When? Is he okay? Where is he? Why isn't he with you? You must take me to him." Jason saw the almost blind panic on her face. "Please, Jason, right now." Jason watched as Gracie ran out of the kitchen, then stopped, as if remembering something, and ran upstairs again. Jason caught up with her at the bottom of the stairs as Gracie was putting on her coat. "Please calm down, Gracie. It's too late to go anywhere now, and it's too far away." Gracie was frantic as she tried to put on her coat sleeve. "Damn it, Jason. No, we're leaving now. I have to see him." Jason held her tightly and said firmly, "Grace, please." Tears streamed down her face as she broke down and sobbed. "I want my father. I need him. You must take me to him. Please, Jason." She went limp in his arms and cried. Tears streamed down Jason's cheeks as he watched the love of his life fall apart. In a calm tone, he persuaded, "Gracie, dear, please trust me. I will do everything possible for you to meet him. Today we need to talk, and then we will find a way to do it. Think of it this way. Now we know he's safe and healthy. I know where he is, and I can contact him when the time comes." Gracie wiped her tears and sobbed. "Did you really see him, talk to him?" Jason smiled and nodded. "Yes, dear, I talked to him almost all day." Jason spent the entire drive home struggling with how to tell Gracie. The next few minutes will show whether his idea was correct. He wrapped his arms around Gracie and held her. "I know how you've been tossed between hope and despair since I've known you, all because of your father's disappearance. I know that you want more than anything to go to him, but believe me, now it would be a step backwards." Jason looked Gracie straight in the eyes. "Think, we are one step closer to our goal of bringing your father back to you. We have a direction, but with that direction, there are many pitfalls to avoid, and we need to tread carefully and find the safest path." Gracie sat and listened to Jason. She heard the concern in his voice, but she also heard the strength, the backbone in his tone. It gave her hope that her lover had the answers. She knew that Jason always thought through any problem carefully and could be relied upon. "I love you, Jason, and I know I trust you. It was so unexpected that I lost my temper. Please, dear, tell me about my father. Give me hope that everything will be as before." Jason's brow furrowed at that last request. "Gracie, my love, nothing will be the same by definition. All we can hope for is that we have the strength to accept what is." Gracie realized that Jason was struggling with something he didn't want to reveal, but knew he had to. "Is there something bad you have to say, and you don't want to hurt me more than I already am?" Jason lowered his head and nodded. "I'm afraid the situation will get worse before it gets better." "Jason, you're scaring me. Please just tell me what happened." Jason's jaw tensed in determination. "Let me play devil's advocate. Perhaps I am the only one who can objectively analyze all the facts and get to the truth. What do you remember about the day your father disappeared?" Gracie didn't understand why Jason couldn't just tell her what the problem was, but she remembered that she had agreed to trust him. "Don't know. There was so much going on that day. My mom and I were getting ready for their 15th wedding anniversary." Jason asked cautiously, "What did you and Mom talk about in the kitchen that day?" Gracie thought back and shrugged. "I'm not sure. It was 4 years ago, but I think it was about preparing for the evening. I agreed with the nanny and Dad, these are Dad's parents, about dinner at the Harriet Hotel. I booked a room for my mom and Dad for the honeymoon they missed when they first got married." Gracie's face showed the concentration of memories of such long-ago events. I agreed with the nanny. It was supposed to be a surprise for both of them, but Mom found out, but promised to keep it a secret from Dad. We talked about keeping Dad busy so we could decorate the ballroom at Harriet's. All their friends and relatives were supposed to come to this significant evening. Jason listened carefully. Afterwards, Mom and Dad were going to go up to the bridal suite for a special night together. The evening was a disaster, I can say. The boys were supposed to keep Dad busy until we called them to get Dad dressed and bring him to the hotel, but they couldn't find him. They waited 2 hours before they called Mom and said Dad didn't come home. They were going to play golf with him, but he never showed up. How does all this relate to his disappearance? Jason sat there, absorbing everything Gracie said. I think there was an unfortunate misunderstanding about what was discussed that day. I can see why this happened, and if your father had come to you in the kitchen when he heard your conversation, everything would have been resolved a long time ago. I don't understand. If he heard what we were saying, how could it be misinterpreted? We did not say anything that could be misunderstood. This was the moment he feared most. Returning to the kitchen, he took out his briefcase and took out the papers Dan had given him. Handing 4 of them to Gracie, he stood nearby. The conversation itself may not be Gracie, but if you add this to it, everything changes. This was the moment he feared most. Returning to the kitchen, he brought his briefcase and took out the papers Dan had given him. Handing 4 of them to Gracie, he stood there. The conversation itself may be no Gracie, but when you add that into the equation, everything changes. Gracie took the forms and read them. I don't know what they mean. Why did you give me the DNA results? Gracie looked at them again. They don't say who they are for, only items A, B, C, and D. These are the results for you, your brothers, and your father. Gracie felt sick in the pit of her stomach, but tried to ignore the consequences. Oh God, Jason, don't do this to me. These are just points on a graph. I'm not a geneticist. I can't read this. Jason handed Gracie the last page of the report and waited for her to read it. He saw the color drain from her face as her hands shook and the page slipped from her hands. Staring into space, she muttered, "This is not true. This must be a mistake." Looking at Jason with pained eyes, she sought comfort, but found only the sadness she felt. He's my father, Jason, always has been. I don't care what this report says. I want you to take me to him. Please, Jason, please help me. This can't happen. It's so unfair. Tears streamed down their faces as Jason sat next to his bride and held her as she mourned her father. Speaking to both herself and Jason, she said, "You know what this means. He thinks I knew about it. He thinks I don't love him. He thinks I set my mother up with her lover." Jason simply hugged her and sighed, "Yes, Grace, he thinks so, but we have to look on the bright side. I'm pretty sure this is something we can fix. I was pretty sure you had no idea. We just need to find out what really happened then." Gracie began to emerge from her depression and was replaced by white-hot, angry rage. There's only one person who knows everything, and once I kick her ass, she'll never give a proper shit again. Gracie wanted to go to her mother immediately, but Jason convinced her to wait until morning in the vain hope that Gracie would calm down a little before she confronted her mother. For the next couple of hours, Jason and Gracie discussed his conversation with her father. Gracie stewed all night instead of calming down as he had hoped. She burst into her mother's kitchen, threw the DNA results on the table and cursed. "Okay, Mom, who the hell is Edward Carlisle?" Catalin simply looked at her daughter, stunned and silent. The fact that Gracie never swore, and certainly never swore at her, was the reason for her failure. "I beg your pardon, young lady. You will stop swearing right now and tell me what's wrong." Gracie stood with her arms crossed, glaring daggers at her mother. "Edward Carlisle? What the hell does he have to do with me and my brothers?" Caitlin's face didn't recognize anything for a few minutes and then turned pale. "I don't understand what you mean. He's nobody, just someone I knew a long time ago." "Don't tell me about it, Mom. If it's not him, then who is it? Who is our biological father?" Caitlin's vision narrowed until she fell to the floor. The shock of the past which came back and haunted her, completely absorbed her feelings. The next thing she knew, she was lying on the couch, Jason rubbing cold liquid on her forehead, and Gracie pacing back and forth, muttering to herself. "Are you all right, Mrs. Mason?" Calm voice Jason was enough to bring her state of mind back to the forefront, but then the thought of her sins now being exposed brought on a cascade of tears. "Oh God, I'm so sorry, Gracie, please forgive me. I never wanted anyone to know what I did," she cried openly. Gracie stopped, turned around, and returned to her mother. "Well, damn it, it's too late for tears, Mom. You ruined our whole family, and why? So you can have some dirty fling with an old guy to take away your lonely nights?" Jason looked back at Gracie. "Stop it, Grace. This isn't going to get us anywhere. You're angry, and your mother knows it. Blaming her without listening to what she has to say will only complicate the situation. If you don't hold your tongue, then I'll take you home and deal with this myself." Gracie looked at her fiancé, saw the determination on his face, and stepped back. "Okay, Jason, I'll listen, but at the first sign that she's sugarcoating this, I won't be held accountable for my actions. Let's see how you can justify your cheating behind your husband's back." Jason shot a look at Gracie that made her freeze. "That's enough, I said it." Kat patted Jason's hand. Despite her sobs, she managed to say, "It's okay, Jason. She's right. It's entirely my fault. Because of my actions, I lost my husband and in turn sent her father away." Jason stood up, fetched a glass of water from the kitchen, and offered it to Caitlin. "Drink it. You'll feel better." Kat sipped her water and thought about how to tell her dirty story. To begin with, Edward, or as I think of him, Eddie, was my boyfriend before I started dating your father, and as far as I understand, Daniel Mason is your father and no one else. Grace saw the determination on her mother's face. "Eddie hounded me for months to sleep with him, and when I finally decided he was the one I wanted to marry, well, I let him have me. That night, after we made love, he told me that he was going abroad for work. I told him that I couldn't go with him, and that he said that he knew that I couldn't, and that was it. This time with a smug smile on your face." Catalin dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a napkin. "He got what he wanted, and now he threw me out of his bed. I was hurt and angry that he led me down the proverbial garden path. The next evening I met Dan, and he consoled me. I never told him Eddie was my first, and your father never asked." Kat looked at her daughter. "You have to understand that I was lost and actually threw myself at your father. I don't know a single man who could stand up to a woman with the determination with which I had to take revenge on Eddie." Kat lowered her eyes in shame. "A month later, I found out I was pregnant with you, and as far as I knew, Dan was your father. Dan was and remains a good, decent man and the husband any woman could dream of. He showed me all the love he had. It never even occurred to me that Eddie could be your father." Kat stopped to take another sip of water and looked at her daughter bitterly. "Please believe me, dear, I didn't know then. Honestly, I thought Dan was your father, and he was so into you. He loved you even before you were born. I can't tell you how he lay next to me, watching you kick and putting his hand on my stomach and waiting to feel his baby's next move." Kat choked. "You are his daughter, no matter what those tests say. You have always been his little girl. I can't count how many times he's bent someone's ear about how cute his little Gracie is and how smart and beautiful and funny you are." Grace cried as she listened to her mother's confession. She missed her father terribly, and the last 4 years had been a nightmare for her. Now, now because of you, he tells everyone that he doesn't have children." She grinned evilly. Without looking at Gracie, Jason raised his hand to stop her from continuing. "It's okay, Mrs. Mason. Gracie was hurt by all of this. Please continue." Caitlin looked at Gracie and wrung her hands in pain and sadness at the suffering she had caused her daughter. "Your father still loves you, Grace. I know it in my heart. He may well hate me, and I completely understand why he does. I've made some stupid mistakes, and they're going to cost me dearly. If I can, I'll do my best." "Yes, you may want it, but it's none of your business, is it?" Gracie snapped. Catalin began to cry again. I'm so sorry, honey, I don't know what to say. Part of me wishes this had never happened, and yet, if I hadn't, your father and I wouldn't have the three of you. Jason called for a break so Caitlin could pull herself together and he could get Gracie to drop the charges, at least until they knew the full story. Jason watched Mrs. Mason for signs that she was making something up, but decided that she wasn't. They took her by surprise and everything poured out of her, as if a dam had burst, and all the secrets she had kept for years were now revealed. Jason rubbed Kat's shoulder and asked her to continue. I know this must be difficult, but for us to get through this, you have to tell me everything. Mr. Mason wants nothing to do with any of you, but I have a simple promise from him, and that is that he will listen to me once I have all the facts. This means I need the truth, no matter how ugly it may seem. The truth is the only way Gracie or her brothers will ever be able to see their father again. Catalin sat up straight and choked back a sob. You're right, Jason. It doesn't matter what Dan thinks of me. I made this bed, and I'm cursed to sleep in it for the rest of my life. I destroyed my marriage. I'll be alone if I have to. I have to disappear if it means the children will bring their father back to where he belongs. Gracie started laughing hysterically. What? Are you going to become a martyr, do a noble deed, and fall by the sword? Catalin snapped and jumped up, punching Gracie, catching Jason off guard. I know you're hurting, and I can't tell you how sorry I am for everything I've done for our family. I don't want to go anywhere. I love you all with every ounce of my being, just as much as your father does. If this is the only way and means that your father will return to you, then yes, I will do it gladly. The sheer force of her words and actions made Grace recoil in fear. Catalin was sorry that she hit her daughter, but she was offended that Grace did not see her sincere repentance. So get over your hatred of me, and let's find some ground where we can move forward and get your father back where he belongs. I'll tell you everything Jason needs to know, no matter what I look like. If you want to see me as some kind of woman of easy virtue, then so be it, because I can tell you that this is much preferable to what we have endured for the last 4 years. Gracie couldn't stand it and started crying. Catalin softened her demeanor and took her daughter in her arms and hugged her tightly. You will get your father back, darling, I guarantee it, and whether I will be there remains to be seen. I have always loved my entire family, including your father, and would not want to willingly hurt any of you, especially your father. Gracie calmed down enough to ask, I understand and can even forgive my conception, but what were you thinking about with the boys? They have the same DNA as me. You understand that this is where everything is solved. Catalin nodded grimly. Yes, dear, as much as I love your brothers, I must admit that conceiving them was my biggest mistake. The only excuse I can offer is that your father and I desperately wanted to have more children. After 5 years of trying, I then realized that Eddie must have been your biological father in the first place. Kat put her hand to her mouth and felt sick. He was a selfish, self-absorbed son of a bitch, and the thought of me having to play along with him almost made me back down. The only reason I went back to him was because he has the same looks as Dan. Same eye and hair color, same build and height. Perhaps I should have backed down, but I didn't. Caitlin didn't want to continue, but she knew Gracie needed to know. I only saw him twice to get pregnant, and the last time I insulted him for his attitude. I couldn't go through it again. I was lucky, if you can call it that. He truly considered himself God's gift to women. I let him know that he had no idea what lovemaking or even good sex was. Kat grabbed Grace's shoulders to get her undivided attention. I don't know if this will make you feel better, not my love. I never told him about you or why I was dating him again. He didn't even ask. I didn't tell him that I was married or that Dan was now my husband. To him, I was just some prostitute in round heels that he picked up on the street, ready to have sex with him, and he had fun, and that's what I wanted. That's all I could do. Catalin held her daughter at arm's length and looked into her eyes. Since then, I have never seen or heard of him. I swear with my last breath, I have never emotionally cheated on your father. Yes, I cheated physically, but at the time I convinced myself that there was a good reason for it. If it weren't for the fact that we have two wonderful boys in our family, then I would regret my actions. I can't do this, and no one else should suffer because of my stupidity, so I will pay what I have to pay to get your father's home back to you. Still holding Gracie, she turned to Jason. I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've done for us, Jason. If there is no other way out of the mess I created, it showed me how much you love Gracie. You look so much like Dan that I'm glad to have you in the family, just like Gracie's dad. I'm not sure if I should ask you, but could you please speak to Dan on my behalf and explain that his children have done nothing to deserve his wrath? I don't care what you say about me, but for the love of God, make sure he knows the kids aren't to blame for this fiasco. Jason smiled. Don't worry about anything, Mrs. Mason, and I'll do my best. I'm as interested in this as any other man. After all, if I can get him back, then you will marry me. Gracie wiped her eyes. What the hell are you talking about? I never said that. Jason shrugged. Well, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I knew you wouldn't be happy walking down the aisle with anyone other than your father, and I had to find him to ask for your hand in marriage. Catalin smiled at Jason, then turned to Grace. You have one amazing young man here, my dear, so don't let him leave. Forgetting for a moment about the reasons for this conversation, Gracie chuckled nervously. I'm not going to stay quiet, so we better get this all figured out so Jason can go and present our case to the judge. Jason and Gracie spent the night at her mother's house, and the next morning he called work and asked for 2 weeks of family leave. I don't know if I'll need all this time. If I can solve my problems earlier, I will return as soon as possible. Jason's boss grumbled, but gave in to his needs and wished him well. Okay, son, you're a good guy, and we have a lot to thank you for, so do what you gotta do. What did you do last month? Jason stuttered. Yes, sir. I am well aware that I overstepped my bounds and will be punished, but I needed to do something to help my family. Mr. Rogers snorted. I'll see what I can do to back up your story with some relevant documents. For some stupid reason I like you, but let me warn you now. You've used up your get-out-of-jail-free card. I won't be so lenient next time. Jason breathed a sigh of relief and thanked him for his generosity. Over the next 2 days, Caitlin, Jason, and Gracie discussed what led to their situation. Jason has seen the pieces of this puzzle come together, and now he has formulated a feasible plan. The first moves have been made in this chess game, and now Jason must place his pieces where they should be in order to go to checkmate. Gracie sat nervously on the bed of a pleasant but still unnamed hotel on the outskirts of town, while Rob and Josh sat on the only 2 chairs. He's not going to show Jason. Jason patted Gracie on the shoulder and winked at the boys to reassure them. It's only 11 o'clock. He said he'll probably be here before noon, so stop worrying. He gave me his word that he'll show up. Your father is a man of his word, and so am I. Gracie was so nervous she couldn't stop shaking. Why couldn't you just take us to him? Jason sighed. For the 10th time, honey, I promised him not to tell anyone where he was, and I'm a man of my word. My promises mean everything to me, and short of risking life and limb, I will do everything in my power to never let him down. Rob smiled. Jason is like our father, Gracie. Mom is right. Dad will like it. Now shut up and wait. You're driving us all crazy with your worrying. Only 15 minutes later, they heard a knock on the door. Jason stood up and opened it to see Dan Mason standing there with a scared look on his face. Hello, we met again, Mr. Stevenson. Glad to see you. Jason extended his hand and shook. Same thing, Mr. Mason. I'm glad you were able to do it. Not come in, are you? I think there are people here who really want to see you. Jason stepped aside to let Dan pass. The bright light outside made it difficult to see until his eyes adjusted to the dim light inside the room, and they watered when he saw his children standing together, nervously awaiting some kind of recognition from him. Oh my God, you've all grown up. Dan wiped the tears from his eyes and held out his hands. Gracie was the first to cling to her father, her brothers not far behind her. "Oh God, Dad, we missed you so much." Gracie chatted as they all tried to get some benefit from their father. Dan was nearly knocked over if it weren't for Jason's helping hand behind him. After a few minutes of jostling, they all settled down on one of the beds. Gracie never let him go, in case it was some kind of dream she never wanted to wake up from. "Don't you dare leave again, Dad. We don't care what those DNA results say. You are and will always be our father. Whoever this idiot is, or was this, is, well, he means absolutely nothing to us or Mom." Gracie was talking a mile a minute, trying to get out everything she had accumulated during the years of her father's absence. Jason stood to the side and watched with a lump in his throat. The scene before him was something out of a romance drama novel. "I guess I could apologize. I have things I need to do, and I see that all is well in this camp. So if you'll excuse me, I'll say goodbye to you all. I booked a room for 4 people with a restaurant across the street, and I booked this room and the one next door for the weekend. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon to pick you all up." Gracie looked at Jason and back at her father. "No, Jason, you have to stay. You are the reason we got our father back. You can't just leave now." Jason shook his head as Dan rose from the bed to shake Jason's hand once more. "Jason really is a sweet pea. We need to spend time together, and I think Jason knows that. Young man, I have a lot to thank you for, and I hope that we will have many discussions in the future." Jason smiled. "Your father is right, Gracie. You need this time to yourself. He is just one person, and there are 3 of you who need his time and attention. I'll have a chance to meet you when you all get tired." After kissing Gracie and shaking hands with the boys along with Mr. Mason, Jason turned and walked through the open door, carefully closing it to the sound of questioning chatter. The drive home was in a good mood. His mother said many times that there was nothing more satisfying than doing something for someone else. She was a firm believer in karma, and if her beliefs were true, then at that moment his bank was full of good karma. Arriving at Mrs. Mason's house, he didn't even have time to get out of the car before Caitlin stood there with questioning eyes. "How did it go? Dan showed up? They—" Jason smiled as he got out of the car and put a finger to her lips to silence her. "Everything went according to plan, Mrs. Mason. As you can see, they are not with me. They'll have the whole weekend to get to know each other." When I left, there were 4 very happy smiles on their wet faces. Catelyn hugged Jason fiercely. Thank you, and thank you again. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how glad I am that their father is back with them." Catelyn staggered, suddenly felt all her energy evaporate, leaving her exhausted and tired. Jason helped her into the house and brought her a cup of tea. For the rest of the weekend, Jason kept Caitlin company as she chatted endlessly about her family and what happened so long ago. "You know, Grace has a special bond with her father. When he went missing, we checked hospitals and police until we drove them crazy. None of us ever lost hope that one day he would return, even when everyone else said we needed to move on. We all knew that he was still alive and that we had to find him. I can't tell you how much we appreciate your help in finding Dan for us. I don't know how I can thank you enough for everything you've done for my children." Jason felt a glow of satisfaction run through him. Seeing the look on Gracie and her brother's faces was gratitude enough, Mrs. Mason. The fact that you enlightened 1,000 times, that's all I need to make me feel good. However, let's not count your chickens before they hatch. We still have many miles to go before we can firmly believe that everything is back as good as we can expect. Kat patted Jason's arm to reassure him. If all that comes out of this is Gracie and the boys going back to their dad, then I won't ask for anything more. I have no illusions about where I will end up after all these events. I spent last night thinking about what I want and what I need, and I came to the conclusion that it doesn't really matter what happens. As long as Dan stays with his kids, I have more now than I've ever had before. Expected. If by some miracle Dan decides to let me have more, I'll just thank my guardian angel for looking out for a stupid idiot like me." Jason thought as Kat finished, "It's up to Dan to give me something more than I have now, and if he wants me to leave, I'll be sad to leave. but I'm sure that what about our children will be well taken care of. Jason said nothing and let Caitlin do the talking, knowing that she needed to get it all out and have a sympathetic ear to listen. He simply nodded in response. You know, when Dan left that day, I never once thought that my infidelity was the reason for his leaving. I had so effectively erased the whole sordid story from my memory that I had no idea why Dan left. Caitlin started crying. When Gracie came in the other day and asked who Edward was, I had to wonder if I even knew Edward. It wasn't until she asked me what he had to do with her and her brothers that I really remembered. My whole world came crashing down on me at that moment. I felt like my chest was going to collapse, and I must have blacked out because the next thing I know is you with a rag on your forehead. You really scared us when you fell from your chair in the kitchen. I thought you were having a heart attack. I felt as if I had it. I still don't understand how Dan found out. These were only 2 meetings, and each lasted no more than 30 minutes. I can help you with this. Mr. Mason saw you leaving Harriet's with Mr. Carlyle. I'm not sure if it was the first or second meeting, but he immediately hired a detective to follow you, but you returned to the role of the ideal wife. He thought it was a coincidence or an isolated incident. He debated whether to blame you, but he had no proof, and he didn't want to lose Gracie over something he couldn't prove. It wasn't until you told him you were pregnant with twins that he decided it was too coincidental to be an accident and waited until they were born to do a DNA test. Kathleen shook her head. What have I done to this poor man? He kept it a secret all these years. It must have been killing him from the inside. I still don't understand why, when he found out that the twins were not his, he didn't come to me then. Jason shrugged. I think he realized that when he found out that Gracie wasn't his either, he panicked. His attachment to Gracie was so strong that he could not imagine how to live without her. Even in the best divorces, conflict over child custody creates tension. I guess he figured that if he could raise one other person's child, 2 more wouldn't make much of a difference. Since he had not seen any other affairs, he simply accepted the fact that he had been deceived and that in the event of a divorce, he would lose more than he would gain. Kathleen shuddered at the word cuckold. Dan was never a cuckold, Jason, and I am outraged by such an assumption. Jason's brow furrowed. I'm sorry, Mrs. Mason. I did not want to offend you with my assessment of the facts. My mother always told me that to understand a person, you must first step into his shoes. See the world through his eyes. Not everyone sees the world the way you do. You caused your husband a lot of pain, but I think the worst of it was when he thought you were turning the kids against him. We can take some peace of mind knowing that it wasn't true. Do you know where the term cuckold comes from? Kathleen felt anger again at Jason's reluctance to drop the matter. No, Jason, I don't know where this word comes from. It sounds terrible, and I don't like it. Jason nodded. The term comes from the cuckoo bird. She lays her eggs in other people's nests, and when the cuckoo hatches, it pushes the eggs of other birds out of the nest and takes their place. Most cuckoos are much larger than their parent birds, but they do not know that they are raising someone else's chick and diligently feeding it. With great respect, that is exactly what you did to your husband. You forced him to provide for other people's children. I believe the only reason he allowed you to continue is because he himself cannot have children. Kathleen began to cry again, realizing what she had done. She never looked at it from anyone else's point of view. You must think I'm a monster. Jason smiled sadly. No, madam, I don't think so. I know that you loved your husband and still do. Remember, I've been here many times for dinners. I never asked, but always wondered why you put an extra plate on the main place when no one sits there. I think it was a subconscious action to show who is the head of the family, whether he is here or not. Jason scratched the back of his head thoughtfully. I remember a case when one of the relatives wanted to sit in this place, and you made it clear that this place was for your husband and no one could take it. I remember you kicked them out when they said it was time for you to forget him and move on, and that he had moved on with another woman. Kathleen remembered the quarrel and the tears she shed after that. For such a young man, you truly have the gift of insight. Jason laughed, then apologized for his outburst. I'm sorry, madam. It's just that you already have someone here who looks so much like my mother that it's almost frightening. You said that I remind you of your husband and that maybe that's why Gracie loves me. I have one more piece of information for you. Gracie looks a lot like my mother. Her temperament and understanding are as strong as my mother's. I know she yelled at you because your father disappeared, but that was an exception. The reason I got along with Gracie is because she sees the person behind the mask. Even her outburst at you was an instant reaction, and she quickly came to her senses. She took the time to get to know the real me. I know that sometimes I offend her, but she knows that I don't do it on purpose. Gracie sat across from her father, watching him speak. Her brothers had gone to bed an hour ago, but Gracie refused to leave her father's side, and Dan could feel it. We need to sleep sometime, honey. Gracie lowered her head, feeling tears welling in her eyes. I'm afraid, Dad. I'm afraid to fall asleep, afraid that I'll wake up, and it will all turn out to be a nightmare. Forgive me, Dad. I'm so sorry. When Jason explained why you left, it confirmed my suspicions that it was my fault that you didn't want to be with us. Will you ever forgive me? Gracie was crying and buried face in hands. Tears streamed down Dan's face, burning him like lava flows as they flowed to the corners of his mouth and dripped from his nose. Reaching out a finger to lift his daughter's chin, he then gently cupped her cheek. Never dare to think like that, Gracie. It's not your fault. I must be on my knees and beg for your forgiveness. It's not your fault, honey. Gracie tried to smile, but couldn't and started crying even harder. I missed you so much, Dad. I didn't realize how important you were to me until you were gone. You always made me so secure and confident. The world could be falling apart around me, but as long as I was in your lap and you held me, I felt like I was in no danger. I missed you too, honey. I made a mistake that I will never forgive myself for. I should have talked to your mother a long time ago. Without doing this, I had to go to the kitchen and find out what they were really talking about. I had been fighting my emotions for so long that they just overwhelmed me, and I felt like I was drowning. With hindsight and rational thinking now, I see that you could not know and be so affectionate to me. Unless you were an outstanding actress worthy of an Oscar. Gracie wiped away her tears and sobbed in realization. You're not coming home, are you, Dad? Dan turned away from his daughter, unable to bear to see her face in anticipation. No, Gracie, I can't stand it anymore. All the lies and deceit have taken their toll. Gracie saw the pain on her father's face. I don't know if you want to hear this, but Mom loves you more than ever. She never stopped loving you. There hasn't been a day in the last 4 years that she hasn't talked about you. Your father wouldn't approve, or your father would be so proud of how you're doing. I wish Dan was here to see it. When everyone else gave up and told her to move on, she got angry and told them to go to hell. She claimed that you are still her husband, and until your body is brought to her, or you yourself tell her that you are no longer married to her, she remains married to the most wonderful man in the world. Dan sighed and took a sip of coffee. I don't know if this helps, but thank you for telling me. If it makes you feel better, I'm thinking of renting an apartment in the city to be closer to you all. I will still keep my house for privacy. Gracie brightened, but then frowned. Can you afford it? I mean, you left everything behind when you left. Dan smiled and winked. Money has never been a problem for me, honey. It's as if it falls into my pocket. I have enough to do what I want. Gracie smiled with relief. Thank you, Dad. It means a lot to me. Mom took over the management of the business. She let Mr. Babcock organize everything, basically just sign his proposals. A couple of times I heard her quietly ask for your advice on critical issues, but at the end of the day, I think she did a great job keeping the business running. I have so much to tell you about this. I didn't know how I could spend enough time with you and still be with my mom. I think she will need my support for some time. Dan stroked Gracie's hand. I understand, honey. Kyle is a good person. Your mother is smart for trusting him to do what he is good at, and I don't want you to leave your mother for me. This is not what I ever wanted. To change the subject, Dan asked about his daughter's fiancé. What about this young man of yours? He seems very special. You know, I deal with people at work all the time, and he impressed me as a very smart, caring, and honest young man. Do you love him? Gracie smiled and nodded enthusiastically. Oh yes, Dad, he is the whole world to me. I don't know if you noticed, but he looks so much like you that I couldn't help but fall in love with him. Do you really like him, Dad? Tell me what you like. It is very important to me that you approve of it. Dan smiled. There's something about him that caught my attention from the very beginning. I don't know how he found me, but he definitely got under my skin when he left. I have to admit, when he left, I thought about disappearing again because I didn't know if he would keep his word. Glad I didn't do that. Gracie shuddered at the thought of what her father was saying. You can't imagine how my mother and I tried to persuade him to tell him where you were. He only agreed when he called you. He said that he gave you his word and would not break it for anyone. Jason knocked on the door. When it opened, he was greeted with a huge hug and kiss from Gracie. My man is here. I can't express how grateful we are for all your help, dear. Jason grinned. It was my pleasure, Gracie. I couldn't call myself a man if I wasn't trying to bring you back to your father. Dan walked to the door and extended his hand. I want to thank you, young man. If it weren't for your persistence, many things would not have been cleared up, and my children and I would still be unhappy. I believe you had one more question you wanted to ask. What was that, I wonder? Jason's smile widened. I think I wanted to ask you for permission to marry your daughter, if you have a daughter. Dan laughed. It's only thanks to you that I have no doubt that I have a daughter and two wonderful sons. So I can only say yes, you have my blessing and welcome to the family, son. Shaking his hand, Dan added, I guess you want to call me Daddy now? Jason laughed too. It will be an honor for me to call you Dad. I lost my father 10 years ago, so I know how Gracie felt. My mom doesn't talk about it, but I think she misses him the most. I'm sorry about your father's son, but if it's easier for you, I'll be glad to be his replacement, no matter how poor. Well, now that that's settled, I guess you and Gracie have a wedding to plan, and I need to get a suit. On second thought, maybe I'll buy a new one. After all, it's not every day that a father walks his daughter down the aisle. Gracie sat opposite her mother. What did he look like, Gracie? Asked Kathleen at my daughters. Gracie nodded. He looks good, Mom. I think he's taking care of himself. Gracie saw an unspoken question in her mother's eyes. She wondered for a moment whether she should embellish the truth, but then changed her mind. Too many lies have led their family to their current situation. I don't want to hurt you, Mom, but Dad didn't ask about you. I think he still feels pain about what happened. Kathleen buried her head in her hands and burst into tears. I know that I deserve it. What I did is probably the worst thing a wife can do to her husband. Please believe that I never did this to humiliate or hurt him. Your father was the most perfect husband any woman could wish for. I don't know how I'll ever fix this. All I can say is that I am happy that at least you children see your father again. Gracie hugged her mother and whispered, Everything will be fine. You just wait and see. I'll keep talking to him. I told him that you never stopped loving him. Give me some time and I'll turn it around. You'll see. Kathleen gently pushed Gracie away, which surprised her. You won't do this, young lady. You will keep your mouth shut. I won't let you risk your relationship with your father in the vain hope that he will feel something for me. I did it myself and will accept my punishment. I made my choice and I will live with it. If your father decides of his own free will to forgive me, then so be it. All I ask is that he knows that I never stopped loving him and that I have never loved anyone else and never will. I will remain his devoted and loving wife until the end of my days, whether divorced or not. Gracie didn't know what to say or do for her mother. She was surprised that her mother didn't cry anymore. A determination appeared on her face that had not been there for many years. Dad knows that you love him, Mom. We all told him that, and I think he accepted it. I think it is difficult for him to cope with the pain of being deceived. Perhaps, over time, he will find a way to deal with this, and everything will return to normal. Kathleen smiled sadly at her daughter. Like Jason said, nothing will be the same, honey, and it doesn't have to be. What I did will haunt me for the rest of my life, whether I am forgiven by your father or not. I will be grateful for every little thing that comes my way. Now let's forget about it. We have a wedding coming up." Over the next 6 months, the family's life settled into some kind of stable direction. Gracie spent as much time as possible with her father, and Jason also used this time to get to know his future father-in-law better. Kathleen handled the business and planning of the wedding, negotiating with vendors, choosing the venue, and seating the guests. She was depressed that Dan never called her or came to see her. She had to fight the urge to go to him and beg for forgiveness, but she held on and allowed her husband to make the first move. "Are you going to be okay, Dad? I mean, tomorrow? Mom will be at the wedding, and it will be the first time you two will be together." Gracie paused, trying to understand her father's reaction. Dan was also silent, thinking about tomorrow. He promised Gracie that he would do everything possible to make this day a day that she would remember for the rest of her life. The closer the wedding day approached, the more he doubted whether he could handle it and remain calm. He took a deep breath. "If your mother keeps her promise, I'll be fine, honey. Don't worry about me. You have too much to worry about, and I promise that I will be the happiest father in the world." Dan stood in the living room of his house, waiting for his bride to finish getting dressed. This was the same house he had left 4.5 years ago. Mixed feelings overwhelmed him. Kathleen and I left for church an hour before his arrival as agreed. He still didn't know how he would feel when he saw her for the first time. Taking a deep breath, he calmed down, counted to 10, and exhaled. At that moment, he heard the door open and close. He looked up to see his daughter coming down the stairs with 2 bridesmaids. His breath caught in admiration. She was the embodiment of feminine beauty. "Oh my God, Gracie, you are as beautiful and wonderful as your mother." Gracie was beaming with happiness and trembling. "Dad, these words mean everything to me. Do you really think I'm beautiful?" "Without any doubt, honey, without any doubt." Father and daughter were excited, but for different reasons, when they pulled up to the church in a white limousine. Walking down the aisle of the church, Dan felt an almost unreal feeling, as if it were a dream. "Who gives this woman to be united with this man in holy matrimony?" Dan took a quick breath. "On behalf of my wife and everyone gathered here, I place my only daughter, Gracie Lynn Mason, into the loving hands of Jason Richard Stevenson in holy matrimony." Having said his lines flawlessly, Dan kissed his daughter's hand and handed it to Jason. Gracie smiled through her veil, blew her father a kiss, and silently thanked him. Kathleen sat shaking with tears of joy and relief as she watched Dan walk their daughter down the aisle. She was amazed at how he looked in his suit. The years have left no mark on him. Her breath caught in her throat when she heard Dan say, "On behalf of my wife." She knew from Gracie that Dan had composed this answer himself, and she was pleased to know that he recognized her as his wife. Kathleen sat waiting for him to return to the seat next to her. She remembered the conversation with Gracie when she suggested that they sit further away so that Dan would not feel overwhelmed. Gracie assured her that her father insisted that she sit in the front row, as expected of the mother of the bride. Dan didn't look directly at Kathleen as he sat down and waited for the ceremony to end. He didn't acknowledge her presence, just sat quietly with his hands folded in his lap. Kathleen tried not to look directly at him. Restraining herself from rushing to him and begging for forgiveness was the most difficult test of her life. When the priest said the words, "And swear allegiance only to each other," Kathleen quietly screamed and, without thinking, put her hand on Dan's leg. Dan put his hand on hers, and Kathleen thought everything would be fine until his grip tightened and started to hurt. Kathleen clenched her teeth and closed her eyes as Dan lifted her hand from his knee and dropped it back into her lap. No one noticed what happened, and Kathleen began to cry again. She mentally reproached herself for her stupidity. She promised her daughter not to interact with Dan and broke this promise. Dan felt his blood pressure rise, and a headache began. Clenching his teeth, trying to control his anger, only made his headache worse. He prayed that the ceremony would end soon so he could go out into the fresh air. After a painful photo shoot of the wedding procession, Dan quickly disappeared behind the church and vomited. Jason noticed he was gone and went to check if everything was okay. "Are you okay, Dad?" Dan took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his mouth. "I'm fine, son. Stress and tension gave me migraines. I need to go back to my apartment, take my medicine, and lie down." Gracie found them as Jason walked her father to the parking lot. "Dad, you look terrible. What's happened?" Dan smiled faintly. "I'll be fine, honey. The worry gave me a migraine and I need to lie down. Please convey my apologies to your mother and guests." Jason waved to one of his friends. "Bruce, can you take Mr. Mason home? He feels bad." As the car drove away, Gracie looked at her husband. "What really happened?" Jason stroked her hand as he watched the car. "I don't know, but I think that all this has become too difficult for him. But I'm sure he'll be fine." Kathleen was talking to guests at the reception when she noticed Dan was missing. This worried her, and rumors among family and friends did not help. Approaching Gracie, she asked, "Where is your father?" Gracie's face gave her away. Kathleen understood. "He's not here, right?" Gracie shook her head. "No, Mom. He had a migraine and went to lie down. He conveyed his apologies." Kathleen was exhausted. "It's my fault, Gracie. I did something stupid during the ceremony, and I think I ruined his day." Gracie patted her mother's hand. "Don't exaggerate, Mom. We knew it would be a difficult day for him, and at the end of the day, the most important thing for me was walking down the aisle with Dad." Kathleen tried to smile, but it was a sad smile. "Can I ask you and Jason a favor?" When Kathleen voiced her request, Jason went to Rex Patterson, their leader, and informed him of his mother-in-law's wish. Rex nodded and looked at Gracie, who also nodded in agreement. "Of course, Jason, although we have a traditional speech program, there is no reason why we cannot accommodate this desire." Rex tapped his glass of wine to get the guests' attention. "I request your attention." He waited a minute until the guests had calmed down. "We all know why we are gathered for this special event." Rex continued as some of the guests listened while others spoke quietly among themselves. "I have been asked to change the order of the speeches, so without further ado, I will ask the groom's best friend. Just think, why is he called the best friend? Probably because he didn't get married. Lucky guy." There was a small murmur of laughter in the room, and Rex raised his hand. "Oh, I'm so sorry for all of you. This is a tough crowd," he chuckled. Continuing, he finished, "Jerry, I'll pass this on to you, and I'll take a look. Can you do better?" The hall burst into laughter again. The speeches continued as usual with the usual laughter and jokes, wishes, and good family advice. One of them came from Uncle Jason. "Son, I have 2 pieces of advice and 1 note that will save you and your beautiful wife from embarrassment. First, listen to the experience of your elders." He waited until the room had calmed down, some whispering and nodding in approval of his words, and then with a serious face he gave the second piece of advice. "And whatever you do, be sure to get an engineer's certificate for mounting a chandelier in a wedding suite." The audience erupted in laughter as his wife poked him in the ribs and said too loudly in embarrassment, "Damn you, Brian, you said no one would ever find out about this." After that, the hall was filled with laughter, and only when Rex stood up did everyone finally calm down. "Wait a second, people." Rex appeared to be writing something down on a piece of paper and, not very quietly, muttered to himself, "Note to myself, we need to check the fastening of the chandelier." The hall burst into laughter again, drowning out his voice. He was pleased that the guests relaxed with wine and champagne and stopped writing with a mischievous smile on his face. Raising his hands to restore order, he addressed Kat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the last speech of the evening, and it is my pleasure to ask Mrs. Mason to respond on behalf of the bride's family. Caitlin, please." As he sat down, he watched as Katie stood up and walked to the empty chair between her and Gracie, standing between her daughter and son-in-law, placing her hands on their shoulders. During the evening, there was a lot of talk and gossip about the empty chair. Caitlin, although annoyed by the insensitive and meaningless noise, tried to ignore it. Caitlin's eyes slowly scanned the meeting, using the time to collect her thoughts. "First of all, I want to thank each of you for coming today and celebrating this joyful occasion. I am thrilled to welcome a man of Jason's caliber into our family." Turning to Jason's mother, she said, "This speech really should be given by Daniel, but since he is not here, I have to welcome you and your wonderful son to our family. One day I told him that I wanted to meet the person who made him who he is. He replied that I had already met her, that is, my daughter Gracie. Now I want to meet the woman she resembles. I'm sure we will become good friends." Katie took a deep breath to calm herself. "I agree, and I believe that Gracie married a man as kind, generous, and loving as my Daniel. Jason does you credit, Gemma. You can be proud of his upbringing. Without Jason's intervention, Daniel would not have been at our daughter's wedding, let alone back in his children's lives. Jason was able to do what 6 private investigators and tens of thousands of dollars could not." Turning back to the guests, she continued, "I know that if Daniel were here, he would say the same thing. Unfortunately, he was stricken with a migraine and was unable to stay at the appointment." Caitlin studied the faces and saw condescension in some of them. She looked at the empty chair and held back a sob. "Those of you on the Mason family side know the significance of this chair and why I am sitting in one place off to the side." She pointed to the chair. "This is my husband's chair, and although he doesn't sit in it, it's still his, and no one can take his place, especially me. He is, and will always be the head of our family." Caitlin felt tears and leaned lightly on Jason and Gracie's shoulders. Gracie raised her hand and squeezed her mother's hand for support and courage. Caitlin leaned over and whispered something to both of them, and they nodded in agreement. "I know this is not an event where such things are usually said, but in some ways it has a lot to do with the spirit of this meeting. As most of those present at this celebration know, almost 4 years and 9 months ago, Daniel disappeared without a trace. It was our 15th wedding anniversary, and it was the beginning of a difficult and traumatic time for our family, with speculation and rumors." Caitlin's face hardened upon hearing her family's murmurs. "I will put an end to these disgusting accusations against Daniel." Caitlin felt anger at the thought of her immediate family and their snide, hidden remarks. "I came to this conclusion while sitting next to the most wonderful man and husband any woman could ask for. When I heard the vows between Gracie and Jason, I knew I couldn't take it anymore." By this time, an eerie silence reigned in the hall. Even the wait staff stopped clearing the plates. Caitlin looked angrily at the main culprits of the terrible rumors. "At the time," she continued, "I didn't know why Daniel decided to leave me, but now I know, and so do Gracie, Jason, and the twins. Daniel didn't leave me for another woman like they've been saying these last 4 years." Caitlin knew that what she said next would change most of these people's opinions of her, but she didn't care. She had to make things right, no matter the consequences. "Daniel left me because he cheated, not his, but mine." The room sat in silence for several minutes before whispers began. Caitlin looked into the faces of those who accused Daniel and looked them straight in the eye. Most looked away in shame. "Those of you who I won't mention by name, I think you all know who you are. Now you have the real culprit, and that's me. Daniel has always been a faithful and loving husband to me and our children. He was and remains good collateral, a loving companion, and a wonderful father to our children." Caitlin explained most of the details without mentioning that Gracie and the twins were not Daniel's biological children. She told the crowd she was sorry for bringing this shame upon her family and asked for forgiveness from the 4 people directly affected by her actions. "Now everyone knows why I won't let anyone sit in Daniel's chair. There is not a single man among you who can compare with Daniel when it comes to fatherhood, love, and friendship. Sorry to ruin the holiday, but I think if anything good comes out of my mistake, it will be a lesson to everyone about how fragile marriage is and how one small mistake can ruin a perfectly good unity." Turning to Gracie and Jason, she finished, "Marriage is about trust, respect, and love. The loss of any of these elements will destabilize your marriage, as it did mine." Turning back to the crowd, she continued, "I am speaking not only to the newlyweds, but to everyone present. You can all learn from this. I don't ask for forgiveness, and I don't intend to make excuses, because what I did is unforgivable and extremely stupid." Silence reigned in the hall, but this did not stop Caitlin. By my actions, I lost the trust of my husband. Now only my children, my husband, and my Creator can forgive me. Gracie, Joshua, and Robert have already forgiven me, and I am grateful for their compassion and understanding. Now all I have left is the man I love with all my heart and my Creator. I am not sure which of them I will beg for forgiveness to first, and this is a heavy burden that I will have to live with. Having finished her confession, Caitlin returned to her seat and took her glass. I ask everyone to fill their glasses and stand up. I'd like to propose a toast to the bride and groom, Gracie and Jason Stevenson. May their union be happy, loving, and prosperous. Everyone stood up and started applauding. Caitlin was talking quietly with her friends when her mother's sister joined them. The others, knowing that the two rarely agreed on many matters, especially those concerning Daniel's disappearance, said their goodbyes and left Aunt Martha and Caitlin alone. "You must be the stupidest woman in our family." Martha's words were spoken without malice, as a statement of fact. "I don't know whether the stupidity of your infidelity outweighs the madness of your confession to everyone here. However, I must admit that it took courage beyond comprehension to stand there and cut your own throat as you did, my dear." Caitlin stood and accepted the reproach, but did not bend. "Believe me, if I could return everything and not withstand the accusations that will now fly through the family, I would gladly do it. I had no choice, Aunt Martha. I couldn't stand by and let someone I love with all my heart be held responsible for my actions." Martha nodded, understanding. "I believe we have not heard all the details, and I will not press them, my dear. I'm glad your mother and father didn't live to bear the shame of what you did. I dare say that in time the truth will be revealed." Caitlin shrugged. "The people most affected know the truth, and I'm not prepared to discuss the details with anyone until I've spoken to Daniel and gotten his opinion on who should know what." Martha smiled knowingly. "That's as it should be, my dear, but that's not the only reason I came to talk to you. I came to apologize and admit my mistake. I ask your forgiveness for the rumors that I had no right to spread. If and when I have the opportunity, I will personally apologize to Daniel." Martha was about to leave, but she turned around and looked Caitlin in the eyes. "At the time, I didn't understand your refusal to believe that Daniel left you for someone else. I see now that you know your husband better than anyone else, and I respect your loyalty to him. Even though cheating disgusts me, you deserve respect for coming forward and confessing. I hope everything goes well for you and Daniel." Dan walked in and stood in the kitchen doorway. Gracie and Jason returned from their honeymoon a little over a week ago, and it was a family reunion to welcome them back. Caitlin was cooking at the kitchen table with Gracie. Jason stood nearby and chatted, as did other family members and guests. Dan paused for a minute, again wondering if he really wanted to be here. "Caitlin, can you come into the office for a minute?" Without waiting for an answer, Dan turned and headed into what was his office more than 4 years ago. Caitlin turned around sharply at the sound of her husband's voice. Dan hadn't spoken to her this entire time, and now it sounded like the death knell for her future with her family. No one spoke, everyone held their breath and looked at each other anxiously. A feeling of impending disaster hung in the air. A huge lump formed in Caitlin's stomach. Gracie kissed her mother's cheek with an encouraging smile. "I'm sure everything will be okay, Mom. Just remember that everything is with you." Caitlin tried to put on a brave face, but she was sure it didn't work. "Can you finish here for me? The lettuce needs to be washed, and the carrots only need to be grated." Caitlin took off her apron, drying her hands as she walked out of the kitchen. She hadn't felt this nervous since high school. Dan's call scared her so much. Dan was looking out the window, watching the guests in the courtyard, when he sensed Caitlin's presence. Without turning around, he spoke. "Why did you do that?" Kat looked at Dan's back and fidgeted with his hands. She asked herself this question many times. It was forever etched in her memory. "Daniel, can I just say one thing before I try to explain everything that everything?" Dan turned but didn't say anything. The pain on his face was palpable, and it almost knocked Caitlin off her feet. She took his silence for agreement. I know that what I say will be too little and too late. I know I hurt you more than anyone has any right to. All I want to say is that I am very, very sorry for all the pain I caused, and I will do anything, and I mean absolutely anything, to make sure you never feel like that again. Dan heard Caitlin's apology and received part of his question answered. For a moment, he was ready to give up the rest. He saw the sorrow in her eyes and decided that he had to let her express everything so that they could move on, no matter the direction. Without emotion, he replied, "Apology accepted, Caitlin. Now can you explain why?" Caitlin was stunned for a moment at Dan's statement. Were they just words? Does Daniel really believe her, or is he being sarcastic? She struggled to collect her thoughts. Daniel, please believe me that from the very beginning it never occurred to me that Gracie was not your daughter. Dan raised his hand to stop her. I'm sure that was the case. This is not what I want to know. I want to know why you confessed at the wedding. You haven't done yourself any favors, and you've brought a lot upon yourself. Convictions. Caitlin stopped abruptly with a puzzled look on her face. Do you know about this and what I said? I saw the video that was recorded at the reception. I was told that I had the only unedited copy, but yes, I saw it, and I want to know why you did that. Caitlin began to cry and sat down in the chair, her legs no longer supporting her. I had no choice, Daniel. It was either let everyone continue to think you were to blame. I couldn't and didn't want to endure this for another minute. You did nothing wrong. You were the most loving and straightforward husband any woman could ask for. I was angry that people defamed your good name. Caitlin looked up through her tears. I talked to Gracie and Jason before I said anything, and they gave me their blessing. The last thing I wanted to do was ruin their wedding day even more. In a way, it gave me back some semblance of self-respect, even though I had completely destroyed my reputation. I know that my stupidity caused you to leave the church. I can't seem to do anything right anymore. I just keep doing things worse and worse. Seeing you there, handing our little Gracie's hand to Jason made my heart rejoice with joy. You made me so proud. Caitlin completely burst into tears. I'm such a fool. I lost control for a minute and made this stupid gesture. If nothing else, I hope you forgive me and stay with your children. And they really are your children, Daniel, no one else's. I know you love them, and I know for sure they love and adore you. These last 4 years have been so difficult for all of us. Dan watched as Caitlin sat on the floor and sobbed into her hands. Dan had mixed feelings. On the one hand, he wanted to hug her and comfort her. On the other, he felt resentful for her lack of trust and respect for him. The only thing he took away from her confession was that she truly regretted her actions. Kat, it's okay. I was really impressed by your little speech at the reception. I realized that being angry at you forever will not only hurt you, but also me, and will also not benefit our children. That's why I came today. I want to put the past behind me and move forward. I can't say that we will ever be a functioning family again, but I promise to work with you to make our children's lives better, and that doesn't mean that either of us should leave. What do you say? Can you do this for the sake of the children? Caitlin sobbed as she rose to her feet and looked into Dan's smiling face. In a trembling voice, she whispered, "Oh, yes, Daniel, anything you want, just say it and I will do it. I just want to get over my stupid stupidity and move on." Dan walked over and extended his hand. Well then, come on, fool. It's time to try to restore your reputation. I'm pretty sure there are some very nervous family members out there who think World War Roman III is starting. I'll distract them while you go and fix your makeup. You look terrible, woman. Caitlin let Dan help her up and wanted to hug him, but hesitated. Dan realized this and hugged the mother of his children, and Caitlin melted into his arms without a fight. Kat gave Dan a gentle squeeze before retreating. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for being you. You have no idea how much this means to me. If you could fulfill one more small request. She looked into his eyes, expecting a refusal. I think I can be generous enough to give you one more request. What is this? Caitlin felt a huge amount of tension release. You're too good for me, Daniel, too good. When things calm down and you feel more comfortable, will you let me tell you everything? I don't want you to guess. I want everything to be open. I know that what I say may hurt you even more, but I feel that not saying it will be worse. Can you do this for me? Let's see. No promises, Kat. It's too early to make them. Let's see how today goes. Gracie looked at Jason for reassurance. What do you think they were talking about? The others in the room were also whispering about the same thing. Jason shook his head. Don't worry about things that are out of your control, Gracie. They have been there for half an hour already. There are no shouts or quarrels. This in itself is a good sign. I have an idea, but I don't want to prejudge a possible reconciliation. Katie and Dan walked out of the office into the waiting kitchen. It was clear from Katie that she was crying, and Gracie's heart sank until her mother came and hugged her, whispering in her ear, "Don't worry, dear, I'm fine, and everything is fine. Your father is a wonderful man. Now I need to fix my makeup. Is everything ready for the barbecue?" Gracie squeezed her mother and nodded. Everything is ready, and Jason has fired up the grill on the patio. Gracie turned to her father with a wide smile. "What have I done to deserve a father like you?" Gracie hugged her father as if her life depended on it. "I ask myself the same question, Gracie. Even after everything that has happened, I have to thank your mother for giving me such a loving daughter and two wonderful sons." Looking over Gracie's head, he winked and smiled at Jason. "But I think we have one more person to thank. Isn't that right?" Gracie looked at her father's face and saw who he was looking at. "You're right, Dad. I not only have the best father in the world, but also the best husband." The whole day passed in conversations and meetings. Dan chatted with the guests, reminiscing about old times, but one topic was tacitly left out of the conversation: the outcome of the relationship between Dan and Katie. Katie was sweeping the kitchen floor when she heard the doorbell ring. Putting the broom back in the closet, she went to open it. A young man of about 20 stood on the threshold with an envelope in his hand. Caitlin froze for a moment and waited for him to introduce himself. "Are you Mrs. Caitlin Mason?" Caitlin felt fear so strong that she felt sick. She managed to stay on her feet. "Yes, how can I help?" she asked anxiously, waiting for those three fatal words that she had been dreading since Daniel returned. "You have been handed." The seconds passed like hours, and the man just stood there with a curious expression on his face, as if mocking her. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Caitlin could only nod. "Okay, I have a registered letter for you. Can you sign here, please, ma'am?" With these words, he took out an electronic device with a screen and a stylus. After signing and thanking her, Caitlin closed the door and looked at the envelope as if it was about to be attacked by a snake. She sighed and realized that she had been holding her breath almost the entire time the courier was at the door. Placing the letter on the coffee table in the living room, she sat down and just stared at it for a few minutes, trying to work up the courage to open it. "Gracie," she said into the phone, "can you come over for a minute?" Gracie was worried when she walked through the door. "What happened, Mom? What's wrong?" She saw her mother sitting on the floor by the coffee table, looking at the envelope. "Mother, why are you sitting on the floor? What happened?" Caitlin looked up. Her eyes were full of tears. She pointed to the letter. "It arrived by registered mail an hour ago." Gracie glanced at the envelope. "You didn't open it." Her mother shook her head. "I haven't found the courage to find out what's inside. I just don't know if I want to know." Gracie sat down next to her mother. "Well, actually, it's generally considered a good idea to open letters, especially if they're addressed to you," she said lightly. Catelyn sobbed. "But what if it's, a legal document?" "Ooh, I understand what you're worried about. What did this man say when he spoke to you?" Katie wiped a tear from her face and sighed. "Nothing much, just asked if I was Mrs. Mason, and when I told him I was, he said he had a registered letter for me and could I sign it." Gracie smiled. "Then I don't understand why you're still bothering to open it." Katie wrung her hands nervously. "What do you mean it's not a legal document? I've never been served any legal documents before, so I don't know if they should say those words or not before handing them to you. Gracie sighed. What words are you talking about? Oh, you mean you got served? Are you worried about this? Gracie saw tears welling up in her mother's eyes and took her by the shoulders to look at herself. I don't know either of the moms, but I know you already signed the letter. As far as the trial is concerned, you received the letter, so it doesn't matter. Katie sobbed as Gracie held her in her arms. Do you want me to open it for you? Katie, her breath caught in her throat, and all she could bring herself to do was simply nod. Gracie took the envelope and stared at it for a few seconds before tearing off the end and blowing into it to open the folds, while Katie closed her eyes and begged, "Please, let it be nothing." Gracie pulled out one sheet of paper and looked into the envelope again. Well, it doesn't look so formal. Catalin opened her eyes and looked at her daughter, looking for any signs of concern as she waited for her to open the letter. The anticipation was killing her, but she couldn't bring herself to ask a screaming question. When she read the letter, Gracie's face went from a frown to a grin to a full-on laugh, and it lifted Katie's spirits. What does it say there? It's an invitation, Mom, and it's gold embossed at that. Mr. Daniel Mason cordially invites Mrs. Caitlin Mason to spend an extended weekend at his lakeside retreat at a time of her choosing. Catalin was amazed. I'm sorry. Gracie looked at her mother, smiling. That's what it says. Dad invites you to stay at his house for the weekend. An extended weekend, no less. Catalin's mouth fell open and Gracie raised her hand under her chin. Shut your mouth, Mom, you're catching flies. Catalin pulled herself together and pushed Gracie's hand away in irritation. What else does it say? Gracie shrugged. Nothing, that's all. As they say, that's all he wrote. Catalin snatched the invitation from Gracie and read it with a frown. Damn this man. He's torturing me. Just before he dropped the axe and cut off my head. Grace giggled. I think you're a little melodramatic, Mom. For God's sake, this is an invitation to a romantic weekend out of town. You should be happy, that's what you want. We want, don't we? Catalin shook her head in confusion, wanting nothing more than for Gracie to be right, but fearing that it wasn't as she said. No, I mean yes. Oh God, Gracie, I don't know what I mean. I really want this to be a romantic weekend, but after everything that's happened, I don't think that's it. What's happening? If this is your father's joke, it's in bad taste. Gracie raised a finger. Just a minute, Mom. She took her cell phone out of her purse and pressed the speed dial button. Hey, Jason, my love. Yes, honey, I know I don't usually call you at work, but I have a little problem and I think your talents could help me. No, sweetie, not this. Gracie giggled into the phone. Although you're doing this for me, you can definitely count on good luck tonight. Gracie laughed again. Ooh, that's great. 30 minutes then? Yes. No. At Mom's. Yes. Okay, see you, bye, dear. Love you. Caitlin barely heard her daughter's conversation, too focused on the few gold-colored words on the paper. Earth to mother, Katie looked at her daughter. What was that? Gracie sighed, putting the phone back in her purse. Jason will be here in less than half an hour, and we can ask his opinion. After a short conversation, Jason looked at the invitation in his hand, scanning it carefully with an experienced eye. Good quality paper, he joked, rubbing the sheath between his thumb and forefinger. Also with gold embossing, good handwriting. Lifting it up to the light and tilting it, he noticed. Ah, yes, but it's obviously fake. It looks like it was handwritten, but now it looks like it was done on a bubble printer. Catalin's nerves finally got the better of her, and she snapped. Stop your detective nonsense and tell us what you think this means. Jason laughed. I'm really sorry, Mom, but I think Dad is inviting you for a weekend to sort out your differences, maybe a nice dinner and dancing at an Italian restaurant. You sit on the terrace, overlooking the lake and chat amicably about how you can both cope with what happened. I think you should accept his offer. What do you have to lose? Katie and Grace looked at each other and Gracie commented, You put all this together from one piece of paper?" Jason smiled. He could see the amazement on their faces, and it amused him. You have to understand that making assumptions based on limited information is pretty sketchy at best. So no, this also stems from the phone call I received from my dad this morning asking if I minded him inviting my mom to the cabin. And judging by the invitation, it seems that now mom will call when it might be. Gracie hit Jason hard on the arm, while Caitlin's legs gave way and she collapsed into a chair. Grace finally laughed. "You mongrel bastard. What else did he say?" Jason's smirk made it clear that his wife's insults weren't affecting him much as he rubbed his arm. "He told me he had a standing reservation at a little place called Giovanni's for dinner and dancing, so I assumed he was going to invite Mom for dinner." Gracie shuddered with excitement. "Do you know what this means, Mom?" When Caitlin shook her head, Gracie continued, "Full press. We're out shopping for a seductively sexy evening dress, maybe a simple little teddy bear that leaves little to the imagination. How about a pair of bikinis?" Caitlin was shocked, as was Jason, and he commented, "Wait, Grace, don't you think this might be too much of a given?" Gracie's face scrunched up in concentration. "You're probably right, Jason. We'll wear a bikini. Maybe Mom would prefer to go skinny dipping instead." Caitlin's face showed amazement at what her daughter meant. "Gracie Lynn, go wash your mouth." If it weren't for the innocent look on her face, Katie would have slapped her. Jason is right. This weekend is not about seduction, but about reconciliation, so we can't make those assumptions. Besides, judging by the damn cool events in my past, I definitely don't intend to make any decisions that will affect our family without your father's input. This will just be your father's way of giving me what I asked for, a chance to explain and state my position. I'll wait until your father decides what we as a family are going to look forward to." Gracie suddenly realized how her mother and Jason had taken her suggestions. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't mean it in a rude or underhanded way." Jason chuckled. "I think I just got a lesson in female psychology. It's something feminine, right?" Caitlin smiled as Jason managed to diffuse the tense situation. "Yes, Jason, it's something feminine. We women use our feminine charms to confuse the man we want. Men do the same, only they use their strength and size to attract and charm their women. The difference here is that this is not acceptable in this case. Men can use their strength and size to either impress or intimidate. Women can use their femininity to either seduce or tease. Acceptability depends on the ulterior motives behind the action." Dan sat on his terrace and thought over and over again why he decided to invite Caitlin here. He needed answers just as much as Caitlin needed an explanation for her actions. He took pen and paper to write down the questions and answers as he saw them. Question 1. Do I still love Caitlin? Answer. Yes. Question 2. Does she love me? Answer. Judging by the video from the wedding, I think so. Question 3. Do I love my children? Answer. Yes, without a doubt. Question 4. Do my children love me? Answer. Again, there is no doubt. Question 5. Does Caitlin understand what she did and does she regret it? Answer. I think so. Question 6. Is Edward Carlisle a threat to my family? Answer. Question 7. Will Caitlin do this again? Answer. Question 8. Will Caitlin tell me the whole truth? Answer. Question 9. Do I trust my wife? Answer. Question 10. Do I want to live the rest of my life without my family? Answer. Dan looked at the list and judged. 10 questions and only 5 answers. Until Caitlin gives me convincing answers to the other 5 questions, I won't be able to make a decision one way or the other. Caitlin sat motionless in her car seat, hands folded in her lap, looking out at the cottage through the windshield. "We're there, Mom," Jason finally announced, wondering if Caitlin was going to come out. She barely spoke during the 4 hours it took to get to the dacha. "Will you go?" Her voice trembled and was so quiet that Jason had to strain to hear her. Jason took her hand and squeezed it lightly in support. "I know you're nervous, but let me say this. If you have any chance of making things right, You need to be painfully honest. No lies, no deception, and definitely no sugarcoating what you did. If you do this, and if my assessment of your husband is correct, then I think you have a good chance of putting this behind you and moving on. Caitlin smiled faintly at the young man sitting next to her. Gracie is proud of you, Jason, and so am I. I think she made a wonderful choice of husband. Thank you for your advice. I will definitely listen to it. Caitlin opened the door and walked out. Taking her suitcase from the trunk, she stood and watched as Jason turned around and drove away. Dan watched through the front window as Jason's car disappeared into the distance. He waited to see what Caitlin would do, and when she just stood there looking straight ahead, he walked to the door and opened it. Are you going to stand there all day, pretending to be a garden gnome, or are you going to come in? Caitlin tensed at Dan's words and looked around hesitantly, feeling like little orphan Annie with her suitcase in hand. When she turned back, she noticed that Dan had walked down the 3 steps of the porch. She took a deep breath and walked towards him. Dan saw the worry on her face and decided to calm her down. Leaning over, he pointed to his cheek. You owe me one. Kathleen smiled. I owe you a lot more than a kiss, she replied, moving closer to kiss his cheek. Dan waited until the last moment and turned his head, allowing their lips to meet. Caitlin froze. It was only a light kiss, but it was magical. She saw the smile on Dan's face, and it gave her hope. It wasn't fair, it was my trick. Dan turned around without taking her suitcase or making any further physical contact. Only because I'm usually the one who gets into trouble, and if we do come to some kind of agreement, I expect that I won't end up there again. You may never have been there before, but damn, woman, you sure know how to make your one and only mistake huge. Caitlin thought to herself, if only you knew how accurate your words are. She joked out loud, I can't believe I fell for that trick. Caitlin used the same technique when she forgave Dan for something he did after he apologized, and it gave her hope that the next few days would be productive. The cottage looks wonderful, just like we dreamed of many years ago. One tear rolled down from the corner of her eye from the loss of these years. Daniel noticed this, holding the door and inviting her in. This was my gift to you for your 15th wedding anniversary, but I got a little distracted at the time for some reason and never got around to showing it to you. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I know I say this all the time, but it's true. Daniel shrugged. Apology accepted. For now, you can put your suitcase in the guest room, but don't unpack it until we talk. I have lunch ready on the back deck, and we can discuss our problems after the meal, if that's okay with you. As she walked through the door, she said, Whatever you want, Daniel, that's what I want, and that's fine with me. Daniel looked at her sadly. It's not you, Katie. You usually don't give up without a comment. Understand? Caitlin started crying again. I understand, Daniel, but you have to understand that I am not the same woman I was 5 years ago. My confidence has taken a hit, and I feel like I'm walking through a minefield here, so forgive me if I don't seem as determined as I used to be. Daniel laughed loudly. Oh, Katie, my dear, no one has ever accused you of arrogance, perhaps of conflict, but certainly not of arrogance. Caitlin beamed at those words, and Daniel noticed. Yes, I said I love you. I have always loved you with all my heart. That's why this whole thing was so traumatic for me. Daniel took Caitlin's forgotten suitcase and put it in the guest room, then led her out to the terrace. Oh my God, this is amazing, Daniel. Caitlin looked around, enjoying the view, before sitting down at an outdoor table. Lunch was quiet. They barely spoke, except for occasional compliments about the food and observations of the surrounding nature. Daniel was placing her coffee in front of Caitlin when she spoke. I don't know what to say or how to start. I don't think I was this nervous even on our first night together. Daniel smiled knowingly. If it makes you feel better, I'll also admit that I'm worried. Much is at stake in what is said today. If it makes you feel better, I'll still take you to dinner tomorrow night. I have a standing reservation, and it would be rude to cancel at the last minute. Caitlin looked at her husband, and his smile was reassuring, even if his words were annoying. Thank you. For a minute, I thought I would go to execution without my last supper. Daniel grinned, and Caitlin echoed his cheerful mood. Then he added, You don't seem too hopeful that we can work things out. Caitlin sighed heavily. I have a ton of hope, but no expectations. I know how much I hurt you with my... Caitlin stopped and remembered Jason's words. By your betrayal, Jason and I talked about this at length, and he helped me understand what it looked like from your perspective. When I realized what exactly I had done and what it looked like, I couldn't even stand with myself. Daniel sat listening to her without interruption. It was the least he could do. At one point, he raised his hand to help her. Can I help you? He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Caitlin. Here are some of my thoughts and concerns. Maybe it will help you understand what needs to be said from my point of view. Caitlin read the paper, nodding and periodically wiping away tears. What can I say? The first question is thank you for it. I prayed not to lose your love. Question 2 is a resounding yes, and no matter what happens this weekend, I will always love you. Questions 3 and 4, I have no doubt about them. I always knew how much you love our children. Question 5, yes, I am more than sorry, as you can imagine. Question 6, the only reason I would want to see this man again is if he was on the operating table and surgeons were removing the organs that our children need. Question 7 is a definite no. I would rather die than insult you again, and I will fight to the end to defend your honor. Question 8, yes. As Jason said, no lies, no deception, and definitely no sugarcoating what I did. Any question you want to ask, no matter how painful or unpleasant, I will try to answer it honestly to the best of my ability. Caitlin paused, thinking. As for the last 2 questions, I can't answer them. That's up to you to decide. I know what I want, as I'm sure you know, but I have no right to demand it. I'm sorry, but these 2 issues will be your burden. Daniel listened silently to Caitlin the entire time as she went through the list. The expression on her face spoke volumes, but most of all it said that she was not hiding anything. In the end, she answered all his questions honestly. Only the details, thoughts, and motives behind her actions remained. Evening was approaching, and the sun had already lost its heat when Daniel suggested, Would you like a swim before dinner? I'll make Thai stir-fry. Caitlin laughed, and Daniel tilted his head. What's so funny? Oh, nothing. I just remembered what I wanted to buy if I had the opportunity to swim. She was thinking about some very revealing swimsuits. Daniel nodded and then realized what Caitlin meant. Oh, I see, and do you want me to show you what I ended up buying? Caitlin went inside to change while Daniel put on his swim trunks. As he walked out of his room, he almost collided with Caitlin. She was wearing a black Pandora Miracle swimsuit, and Daniel thought Caitlin looked amazing in it. The back of the swimsuit fell almost to her butt, and the cutout on the sides showed how small her waist was. For a woman in her early days, she looked 10 years younger, and he commented, I don't know what Gracie meant, but that swimsuit looks great on you. Caitlin pirouetted to give Daniel a better look. Do you think so? Is it too revealing or old-fashioned? Daniel examined her carefully. He was right when he recalled what he said to Gracie on her wedding day. You look absolutely amazing, Caitlin. I can see where Gracie got her beauty from. Caitlin's bright smile made Daniel feel happy. Their conversation during the day had left him a little tense, and it was refreshing to relax. They spent the rest of the day swimming and sunbathing on the pier, and Daniel did a little fishing. After dinner, as they sat sipping wine, Daniel asked again, When did you realize that Gracie didn't? Caitlin quickly intervened. She was waiting for this question. She raised her hand. When did I first suspect that you were not her biological father? He nodded with a grim expression that hurt Caitlin. I suspected something was wrong when Gracie was about 3.5 years old, but I didn't allow myself to believe it. I even went to the family clinic to see if Gracie's birth had affected my ability to get pregnant again. All tests were positive. The doctors saw no reason why I couldn't get pregnant again. And so, when I met Edward by chance about 18 months later, I realized that he must be responsible for my first pregnancy. Daniel listened silently again, allowing Caitlin to be freed from this terrible burden, but finally commented, "And then you made your decision." Caitlin shook her head. "No, several days passed before I came to this conclusion. I thought for days about what to do. Now I know that I should have come to you for advice. That would be the right thing to do." Caitlin sighed heavily. "I just couldn't bring myself to tell you about my suspicions. I knew it would break your heart. And it infuriated me that such a scoundrel as Eddie could have children, and a man of your nature was deprived of this privilege." Daniel could clearly see the pain in Caitlin's eyes as she spoke. She wiped away a tear and looked him straight in the eyes. "There was no conscious decision to cheat on you, Daniel. I don't know if you understand what a woman needs sexually. I don't always understand it myself. There are only a couple of days a month when a woman actually craves sex, and it's more of a biological need for reproduction, as opposed to men who want it all the time. So it wasn't so much a decision as it was not thinking at the wrong time that allowed me to use it. I just let my body do the thinking for me." Caitlin's face hardened. "Before you think he was better in bed, forget it. Even on your worst days, you were an order of magnitude better than Eddie could ever dream of being with any woman. The first time, before I met you, we did this with him for the first time, and then, while getting dressed, he told me about his trip and said that this was our last date. I thought he loved me, and it broke my heart to think that he was using me as a cheap woman of easy virtue to get sex. He was supposed to come to my 21st birthday as my partner. I was hoping we would announce our engagement, but he laughed when I told him so. I saw you at the party, and yes, I was on the rebound. I heard some girls saying what a good and considerate lover you are, and I decided to show Eddie that I could find better than him, and I followed you with determination." Caitlin's face gradually softened, and a mischievous smile appeared on it. "You didn't stand a chance, you know." Dan laughed, remembering their first night. "I have to admit you were special that night. I've never had a night like this with previous girlfriends." Caitlin put her hand on Dan's arm. "All the rumors were true, Daniel. You were and still are the most attentive and loving partner any woman could ask for, and when you asked me out on our next date, I almost went crazy trying to decide what to wear and how to convince you to continue our relationship. I think that's when I realized that I fell in love with you, and the love only grew stronger every year." Dan frowned. "If you and Eddie had sex just a couple of days before you and I, didn't you think he might be the father?" Caitlin jumped up in anger. "Damn you, Daniel, he is not the father of our children." Dan raised his hands in defense. "Okay, bad choice of words, but surely you should have taken into account that he might be responsible." Caitlin stopped, her angry expression softening. "That's why I'm so angry about this whole thing. He used the hell out of defense, and you didn't. What kind of justice?" Dan started to smile and then burst out laughing. "I don't know about you, honey, but I'm actually glad he's such a scoundrel. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Gracie or twins." Caitlin simply shrugged and sat back down, now seeming more tired than anything else. Dan looked at his watch. It was late, and he felt exhausted and tired from all the emotions of the day. "I think it's time for us to go to bed." He noticed Caitlin's expression and felt sad. "I think we've made good progress, but let's take our time, okay?" Dan was preparing breakfast when Caitlin came out. "Good morning, Daniel. This smells amazing. Another thing came to my mind last night. You learned to cook while you were alone." Dan laughed. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. The rest of the day went as smoothly as breakfast. They walked through the forest and talked about various topics, from time to time returning to the main reason for this weekend. Dan looked at his watch. "I think it's time for us to head back if we want to make it to dinner." Caitlin took his arm and joked. "Lead on, my beloved. I'm yours for whatever you want." Dan winced. "God, I both love and hate it when you speak French. I love the sound of the words, and I hate that I don't understand what you just said." Caitlin laughed. Well then, let's go, and if this evening turns out to be half as good as the last couple of days, I'll tell you after dinner when we get home. The dinner was as romantic as Gracie had hoped, and Caitlin looked stunning in her evening gown. Putting aside all thoughts of reconciliation, they enjoyed each other's company until Caitlin noticed that Dan had fallen silent over dessert. Is something wrong? Is there something wrong with the ice cream? Dan shook his head, wondering how to say what was on his mind. Caitlin suddenly lost her appetite for her dessert. Something is bothering you, isn't it? Is there something I haven't explained or apologized for yet? Dan looked into Caitlin's worried eyes and felt like a scoundrel. I'm satisfied with everything you said. Well, not satisfied, but satisfied with your motives. No, now I have to apologize to you. Caitlin's worry turned to worry, and she reached across the table to take Dan's hand. I told you, you have nothing to apologize for, honey. You didn't do anything. It's all my fault. That's where you're wrong, Kat. I've done a lot of wrong things. I could have talked to you when I first found out about your cheating, and then I had the opportunity when I overheard your conversation with Gracie. I did neither and allowed it to continue. I now realize it was wrong of me. When I found out that I was not the father of our children, I also found out that I could never give you children. I felt guilty. Dan played with the dessert. You gave me my dream of a loving family, and I could not return this gift to you. I restrained myself from hurting you with the knowledge that I knew what you did. I have to admit that I hired a detective to keep an eye on you from time to time for the next couple of years, but I never found anything suspicious again until I heard what you and Gracie were talking about and jumped to the wrong conclusions. Caitlin sat thoughtfully, then smiled. So can I consider this forgiveness for my mistake? Dan smiled too. Yes, Kat, you can. I've missed you and the kids these past 5 years. I would really like us to be a family again. Caitlin teared up. Thank you, Daniel. You have no idea how much your words mean to me. Now 2 questions remain. 1, will you keep your promise to dance with me? And 2, will we sleep in the same bed tonight? Dan smiled and stood up, holding out his hand. Mrs. Mason, will you do me the honor of dancing this next dance with me? Caitlin was almost stupefied by these words, but stood up and took her husband's hand. It will be my greatest pleasure to accompany you to the end of the world, Mr. Mason. It was a slow, romantic tune. Daniel and Caitlin intertwined with each other as if these years had never happened and just floated through the music. Caitlin laid her head on her husband's chest and cried with joy and relief as they twirled around the dance floor. Why are you crying, woman? Caitlin pulled back a little to look at the man she adored. Because I'm happy, you fool. I have to admit, I thought it would never happen again, Dan chuckled. Caitlin blinked away her tears and wiped her face. That's how I see it. The question of Gracie's origins is irrelevant, something we had no control over. Not coming to you when I suspected what had happened was my mistake, which will haunt me until my death. Likewise, you could have done the same and come to me when you knew the truth. Arguing about what might or might not have happened as a result of these conversations then is another immaterial issue, water under the bridge, so to speak, so I think we're even on this score. All we have left is your regret that you couldn't give me children. Dan nodded in agreement, and they continued dancing one tune after another, not paying attention to the other couples dining or dancing. Caitlin was simply content to be in her husband's arms again. The last song of the night had finished, and Caitlin was walking off the dance floor with Daniel when she stopped. You know, I remembered what Jason told me. Dan's look urged her to continue, and she smiled. Not here. Wait until we get home, and over coffee I'll try to formulate my thoughts. The drive home was silent, both pondering their thoughts. Dan placed 2 cups on the coffee table and sat next to Caitlin, which she really appreciated. This was not a confrontation, but a real dialogue between 2 loving people. Dan finally started talking. Okay, honey, let's sum it up. I've said everything I wanted to say, but you seem to think there's another important point. So speak up. Caitlin took a sip and cleared her throat. All that remains is your perception of failure that you could not give me children. I don't see this as a failure. Jason helped me understand that not everyone sees the world the way you or I do. This statement finally made me realize the extent of my betrayal. For the sake of argument, let's switch roles. Suppose I couldn't have children, but you could. Let's say you went and picked up another woman to give birth to a child, and somehow convinced her to give up the child and brought it home to me. Here, dear, this is our child. Now you are a mother, and I want you to raise him as your own. This idea was so foreign to me that it blew my mind. I mean, there is no way you could make me believe that this baby is mine. Every woman on earth can point to her children and say without a doubt, this child is mine. The fact that we go through pregnancy, labor, and delivery gives us this confidence. What confidence does the husband have? He points to his child and says, this is my child. Why? Because my beloved wife says so. What kind of love, respect, and trust does it take to say something like that? How vile and disgusting must a woman be to carry another man's child and pass it off as her husband's child? Caitlin paused for a moment to gauge Daniel's understanding, then continued. Without reaching out to me or facing the fact that I got pregnant with Edward's child, you told me, okay, Caitlin, these may be your children, but I will take care of them financially and emotionally. I will be their father. In essence, this is what I would have to do if you brought the child to me to be the mother. And Daniel, I still don't know if I could do it. It requires such dedication that I find it difficult to understand. Caitlin leaned over and kissed Daniel on the cheek. My dear husband, when it comes to love, respect, and, above all, trust, we women do not understand what it means to give ourselves completely. I don't know how many times I've heard my friends say, my husband doesn't understand trust. Now I know what I'll say to those idiots when I hear it again. Caitlin took Daniel's hands. I looked at this problem through your eyes, dear. Now you need to look at it with mine. I know it's your ego that makes you think that way, but a woman's pride is no different. And yes, I gave you children, something you couldn't do for me. But you gave me something equally valuable. You gave me a father for my children, even when you knew that they were not from you. You made them yours the day you welcomed them into our family, and I couldn't love you more for that if I tried. The emotions Dan was feeling took his breath away, and it took him a little while to get over them. He cleared his throat and joked, well, that certainly answered question 5, didn't it? What did you decide about the 9th and 10th questions? A smile appeared on Daniel's face. Yes and no. Yes, I trust you, and no, I don't want to live my life without the woman I love. Daniel's smile became infectious, and Caitlin ran into Daniel's arms. I will love, respect, and honor you for the rest of my life. They started kissing passionately, as if they were trying to make up for all the lost years. How about it, love? Would you like to sleep in our bed tonight? You have no idea how I waited to hear these words. I want nothing more than to spend the rest of the time in our bed. Dan stood up and took Caitlin's hand, leading her into the bedroom. By the way, what did you tell me this afternoon? In English, please. Caitlin giggled. You do it, and if there is justice in the world, I will be the one to enjoy it. Dan turned and looked Caitlin in the eyes. What does this mean? Exactly as I said, plom sur mon amour, je suis à toi de faire ce que vous s'il vous plaît. Lead, my beloved, I am yours for whatever you want. Daniel nodded. In that case, I accept your offer. The smile on Caitlin's face said it all. Oh yes, there is justice, and I am the happiest woman in the world. Just out of curiosity, do you know where Eddie is now? Caitlin frowned. No, and I don't want to know. Why are you asking? Oh, no reason. Just want to know in case he needs urgent and radical surgery. But it doesn't matter. We both know someone who would be happy to find it for us. Caitlin burst out laughing. You are really cruel, and I like it. I'm sure Jason will help us with this. Later that night, enjoying the moment after making love, Dan asked, how do you feel about celebrating our 20th wedding anniversary? After all, I missed the 15th. Caitlin propped herself up on her elbow and pushed Dan in the ribs. Let me remind you that you missed not only your 15th, but also your 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th anniversaries. Dan replied with a smile, the more fun the 20th. Caitlin slapped his arm. You scoundrel, only if you promise to show up this time, I won't be able to face everyone again without you. It was too traumatic for me. Jason and Gracie watched as the car pulled away from the curb and Caitlin turned toward the house. Gracie commented to Jason, that doesn't give me too much hope, honey. Jason patted her hand. Don't jump to conclusions without more information, sweetheart. Caitlin looked tired, even with a noticeable spring in her step, and Jason smiled. Did everything go according to plan, Mom? He asked before she reached the porch. Kathleen smiled. Let me come in and relax a bit with a cup of coffee before the Spanish Inquisition begins. Jason picked up her suitcase and carried it to her room while Gracie bombarded her with questions. What happened? Why isn't Daddy with you? It's okay with both of you. And so on and so forth, even when he went to the kitchen to make coffee. I don't understand, Mom. If everything is okay, why isn't Dad with you? Caitlin didn't say a word as her daughter bombarded her with question after question, until Jason brought out a tray of coffee, cheese, and crackers and placed it on the table in front of her. Mom, will you talk to me? I'm dying of curiosity. Kathleen smiled at Jason in gratitude for his patience. Is she always like this, or has her curiosity only recently developed? Jason laughed. She basically became like this when we found Dad. I usually let her blurt out all the questions until she's exhausted, and then I can get a word in. Gracie snapped, Shut up, Jason, and let Mommy talk. Caitlin frowned. Gracie Lynn, apologize to your husband immediately. But his mother raised her hand and Jason smiled even wider. No, young lady, do it now, or you will be the last one to know what happened at the dacha between your father and me. Gracie sighed heavily, but relented. I'm sorry I yelled at you, Jason. I just lost my cool because the tension is killing me. Jason and Caitlin smiled at each other and Jason shrugged. If you shut your mouth for a second and give your mother some time to calm down, I'm sure she'll tell us both everything. Caitlin laughed at Jason's remark. Thank you, Jason. Turning to Gracie, she added, While I understand your need for information, I think you should take your husband's advice if you want your peace of mind back. Gracie just sat there and looked gloomy. Okay, Mom. Caitlin took another sip from her cup and began. You'll be pleased to know that your father and I are back together. Gracie wanted to say something, but Jason quickly covered her mouth with his hand. Say no more, Gracie. Let your mother do the talking. The reason your father isn't here is because he went to the office to make the necessary arrangements to hand over things to Kyle Babcock so he and I could retire. I'm here to organize a house for moving to your father's dacha. The twins have been trying to persuade me to send them to boarding school for a long time, so they don't need me here. Caitlin could see the questions brewing on Gracie's face, but she continued. You and Jason have your own lives, and your father and I both agree that, if you both don't mind, you could take over the management of this house to save on rent and build up savings to buy your own house. Caitlin sat and waited for the inevitable barrage of questions from Gracie. To everyone's surprise, Gracie remained silent. So, Gracie, are all your questions about Mom and Dad answered? So can I ask you questions now? Gracie sounded offended, which made Jason and Caitlin laugh. I propose one question at a time, Jason joked. Daniel and Caitlin's 20th wedding anniversary went off without a hitch. Months later, while opening the newspaper and reading public news, Dan began to laugh. Caitlin was just setting breakfast on the table. What's so funny? Dan handed the newspaper to Caitlin and pointed to the article. Title: The legal battle promises to be messy. Mr. Edward Douglas Carlyle is currently in court fighting several paternity and child support claims. This reporter believes that Mr. Carlyle allegedly told authorities that he was not the father of either child and condemned the actions of those gold miners as nothing more than resentful claims. He claims that he cannot have children due to a childhood accident. The court is considering ordering Mr. Carlyle to take the test, but there is not yet enough evidence to make it mandatory. A sinister smile appeared on Caitlin's face, and Daniel grinned, knowing what she was about to do. "Just keep us out of this, honey." Daniel and Caitlin gained a new understanding of each other's flaws and feelings, which brought them peace and harmony in retirement. Jason and Gracie moved into the family home and made it theirs until the twins returned from college and university. They soon moved out as they had saved enough to buy their own home. Rob and Josh thought it was magical to have an entire home to live and entertain in, and they took full advantage of it. The Office of the Prosecutors representing the women in Mr. Carlyle's paternity case has received a package. Inside was a lock of hair and 3 anonymous DNA reports identifying the children's sex and age, as well as a cover letter and half a dozen signed affidavits authenticating the sample. To whom it may concern, the enclosed hair sample was taken with the full consent of the owner, one Edward Carlyle, for a charity event. None of the signatories to the affidavits are principals in the current litigation. Best regards, friend. Although the sample could not be tested to confirm its authenticity and was not admissible in court, it was enough for a judge to require Mr. Carlyle to provide a DNA sample under a court order. The consequences of positive identification of the father of these children put Eddie's financial condition in jeopardy. After settling the case out of court for an undisclosed sum, he disappeared into the far corners, away from the media. Since organ donation from Edward Carlyle was not required for the children, Jason did not have to seek one, although he continued to supervise in case of need. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.